Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Nature Channel. Find yourself a comfortable place right now. Maybe you're already lying down, your blanket pulled up close, the room quiet around you. Take one slow breath in and let it out even slower. There's nowhere you need to be tonight. Nothing you need to remember or solve or finish. Just this moment and this voice and a very gentle story waiting to unfold for you. Tonight, we're going somewhere vast and still, a place where the sky seems bigger than anywhere else on earth, where the ground is pale and smooth as paper, and where something quietly magical happens when almost no one is watching. We're going to the desert, not the harsh, burning desert of your imagination, but the soft, silver-lit desert of evening, when the heat has finally breathed itself out and the air turns cool and thin and full of quiet. We're going to talk about stones, ordinary stones resting on the ground. Except these stones are not quite as still as you might think. Across certain dry desert lake beds in the world, stones move. They slide slowly across the cracked earth, leaving long, thin trails behind them like the softest pencil lines drawn across pale paper. No one pushes them. No animals carry them. They simply travel at their own pace, in their own time. And for most of human history, no one could explain it. Imagine walking out onto one of these ancient lake beds in the early morning, the sky just beginning to blush with the faintest pink light. The ground beneath your feet is made of dried mud, cracked into thousands of little puzzle pieces, each one curled ever so slightly at the edges. Like the pages of an old book left in the sun, the surface is pale, almost white, and perfectly flat as far as your eyes can see in every direction. And there, sitting quietly in the middle of this vast emptiness, is a stone. Behind it stretches a long groove in the earth, maybe 30 feet, maybe 100. The stone has been somewhere. It has made a journey, and it didn't tell a soul. These places are called playa lake beds, which is simply a beautiful Spanish word meaning beach or shore. And that name carries its own quiet poetry, because these flat desert floors were indeed beaches once, at the bottom of ancient lakes that existed thousands of years ago when the world was wetter and cooler. Now they hold only memory and silence, and the occasional wandering stone. The most famous of these places is called Racetrack Playa. It lives inside Death Valley National Park in California, in the United States. The name Death Valley sounds dramatic, but at night, especially a quiet desert night, it is one of the most peaceful places on earth. The stars there are extraordinary. There are so few city lights nearby that the sky fills completely with them, layer upon layer of soft white light. The Milky Way stretched out like a gentle smudge of cloud that never moves. Racetrack Playa sits at an elevation of about 3,700 feet, which means it's high enough in the desert mountains to feel cool at night, sometimes even cold. The air up there is clean and very still. When you breathe it in, it feels like drinking cool water. And during the day, the playa bakes quietly under the sun, and at night it exhales all that warmth back into the sky and the stones simply rest. The playa is roughly 2 miles long and 1 mile wide, about the size of a small town, but utterly empty. Walking across it, your footsteps make almost no sound. The dried mud absorbs everything. Sound, like everything else there, becomes very small and very far away. Some of the stones on Racetrack Playa are tiny, no bigger than your fist. Others are enormous boulders weighing hundreds of pounds. And yet, both kinds move. The small ones and the large ones, the smooth ones and the rough ones. They slide across the flat earth at their own unhurried pace, over weeks and months and sometimes years, leaving their delicate trails behind them like quiet signatures. For a long time, for most of the 20th century, scientists genuinely did not know how this happened. They proposed ideas. They argued gently with each other. Wind, they said. Maybe it's wind, or ice, or some slippery layer of wet mud, or all three. But no one had actually seen a stone move. No one had watched it happen. The stones kept their secret patiently, the way old things often do. If you run your fingers along one of those trails, and please, in real life, the trails are fragile and protected, so we'll only do this in our imagination tonight. You would feel the edges of the groove are slightly raised, like the stone pressed the mud up gently as it passed, the way a boat leaves a tiny wake on still water. The earth remembers where the stone has been. It holds that memory for years. Some stones travel in straight lines. Others curve gently, as though they changed their mind partway through their journey and decided to go a slightly different direction. And sometimes, two stones that started very far apart will travel parallel paths, their trails running alongside each other as though the stones were walking together, keeping each other quiet company across the pale desert floor. There is something so deeply calming about this image, isn't there? Two stones side by side, moving so slowly that no human eye could ever catch them in the act, crossing a landscape of pure silence together. They're not in a hurry. They have all the time the desert has, and the desert has all the time in the world. The trails can be extraordinarily long. Some stretch for hundreds of feet. One particularly well-traveled stone at Racetrack Playa has a trail that goes on for nearly 1,500 feet. That's longer than 4 American football fields laid end to end. And the stone moved all that distance without a single push. Other playa lake beds around the world have their own sliding stones too. There is one in Argentina, one in Spain, several scattered across the deserts of the American Southwest. Each place has its own quiet personality, its own particular shade of pale ground, its own quality of light, its own population of patient, wandering rocks. The stones themselves come from the mountains that ring the playa. Over thousands of years, winter rains and the slow movement of rocks loosened pieces from the hillsides, and those pieces eventually rolled and tumbled down to the flat floor below, where they settled and became travelers. They carry the color of the mountains with them: dark dolomite, pale limestone, rough quartzite, little ambassadors from the high places, resting now in the lowlands. If you imagine the playa in moonlight, And this is a beautiful thing to imagine as you're drifting towards sleep. The stones cast tiny shadows on the bright ground. The moon is very generous with its light in the desert, where there are no trees to interrupt it and no clouds most of the year to soften it. The stones sit in pools of their own shadow, looking ancient and settled and deeply, perfectly at rest. And perhaps that is what we can learn from them tonight. Not a lesson, not a lecture, just a feeling. The stones move, but not urgently. They travel, but not anxiously. They go where the night and the wind and the thin, cold water take them, and they rest when those things are gone, and they seem entirely at peace with both the going and the resting. Let yourself rest now, too, just a little. We have so much more of this story to explore together. More desert, more stones, more of the quiet science of how they move, more of the silver-lit world of playa nights. But for now, let your shoulders drop. Let your hands be heavy. And if you're enjoying this gentle journey already, we'd love for you to leave a comment below. Even just a word, just a hello, just a tiny trail of your own to let us know you are here. The desert at dusk does something extraordinary with color. You might think of desert as brown, as beige, as the washed-out palette of a dry and faded world. But in the last hour of sunlight, when the sun is low and heavy and amber, the desert turns every shade of rose and copper and pale violet. The rocks glow. The cracked mud of the playa becomes a mosaic of gold and shadow. Even the air takes on a color, a soft apricot warmth that seems to press gently against your skin like a held breath. This is the light the sliding stones live in. This is the world they know. We talked last time about how the stones move, or rather, about the mystery of it, the long trails, the vast silence, the patience of a landscape that keeps its secrets well. Tonight, let's go a little deeper. Let's sit down right here on the edge of the playa. The dried mud is firm and smooth and still warm from the afternoon sun. And let's let the story of these stones come to us slowly, the way evening itself arrives, gradually, softly, without announcement. One of the most interesting things about the sliding stone trails is that they are not always straight. Many of them curve. Some curve gently, like the arc of a very slow river. Others make sharper turns, almost right angles, as though something changed direction midway through the journey. A few trails loop back on themselves, creating shapes that look almost deliberate, like the stone was drawing something, tracing a quiet pattern in the earth for no audience at all. For a long time, these curved trails were one of the great puzzles. If wind was pushing the stones, why would the wind change direction so precisely? Why would two stones side by side take completely different paths? The curves suggested something more complex, more subtle than a simple push. Scientists who study these stones, and there have been a devoted few, patient enough to spend years visiting the playa, measuring trails, checking weather records, developed various theories over the decades. One early idea was that algae growing on the wet playa surface created a kind of slippery mat that let the stones glide. This was poetic in a way. Tiny living things, invisible to the naked eye, serving as the secret carpet for a wandering boulder. Algae are ancient, you know. They've been on Earth for billions of years, longer than almost anything else that's alive today. There is something quietly wonderful about the idea that these microscopic threads of green life might play a role in the movement of stones across a desert floor, that the very smallest and the very oldest of living things might be involved in something so slow and so large. Another theory involved dust devils, those small spinning columns of air that dance across desert surfaces on hot afternoons, picking up loose sand and swirling it upward in a thin, translucent funnel. You've probably seen them, or pictures of them. They look like very minor, very polite tornadoes. Some researchers wondered if dust devils were nudging the stones sideways, spinning them slowly around, which would explain the curved trails. The idea was charming, even if it turned out not to be the primary explanation. There's a very human quality to the way scientists approach this mystery, and it's worth noticing because it's quietly beautiful. No one was in a hurry to solve it. The stones had been moving for centuries, probably millennia, and they would keep moving long after any of us were gone. The scientists came back year after year, season after season, checking their instruments and their notes, and the playa received them calmly and gave up its secrets only very slowly, the way a shy creature emerges from hiding only when it's certain the danger has passed. In winter, the playa is sometimes visited by rain. In the desert mountains, winter rain is not the heavy, dramatic kind. It's gentle, more like a sustained whisper than a downpour. It falls quietly on the pale ground and collects in a very thin, very shallow layer across the entire surface of the playa. Just an inch or two of water, sometimes less. Enough to make the playa gleam like a mirror under the winter sky, reflecting the clouds and the gray light above in perfect, glassy stillness. This thin sheet of water is important. It softens the top layer of mud just enough to allow something extraordinary to happen. The water sits there for days, sometimes weeks, very slowly evaporating in the cold desert air. And during the cold nights, when temperatures drop below freezing, that shallow water begins to form ice. Not thick ice, not the kind of ice you could walk on or skate on. Very thin ice, sheets of it just millimeters thick, translucent and fragile and lacy at the edges, forming a continuous layer across the entire playa. In the moonlight, this thin ice would glow with a faint blue-silver light. The whole playa turned into one enormous, trembling mirror. It must be one of the most beautiful and lonely sights in the world. And it is this ice, this quiet, paper-thin winter ice, that holds a key to the mystery. During the day, the winter sun warms the ice. The edges of the ice sheets begin to melt first, and as they do, the ice breaks into large, flat panels, almost like the cracked mud itself, but transparent and floating on the thin layer of water beneath. These ice panels are pushed by the wind And as they move across the water, they carry the stones with them. Picture it very gently, the way you'd picture something half-dreamed. The playa is covered in shallow water. The water is covered in thin ice. The ice is broken into panels by the morning warmth. A soft desert wind, not a strong wind, just a breath, just the kind of wind that barely moves your hair, pushes those ice panels slowly across the water, and the stones, caught between the ice and the wet mud below, begin to slide. So slowly, so incredibly slowly, perhaps an inch per second at most, perhaps much less. The stones don't rush. They have nowhere to be. They simply go where the ice and the water and the wind take them, leaving their quiet trails in the mud below. And when the ice melts away completely by afternoon, the stones stop. They rest. They wait for the next winter, the next rain, the next thin layer of ice and wind and slow movement. This explanation, ice panels driven by light wind, was confirmed only in 2014, when a team of researchers finally managed to install sensors and cameras on the playa and actually observed stones moving in real time. After decades of wondering, they saw it happen. Small cameras mounted on poles, GPS devices no bigger than a coin attached to selected stones. And one winter morning, the stones moved. The researchers weren't even there. They saw it later in the data, in the numbers that told the story of a journey they hadn't witnessed directly. There's something a little bittersweet and a little wonderful about that. The stones moved when no one was watching. They kept their privacy. Even the moment of discovery was quiet and second-hand, preserved in data rather than witnessed in person. The playa held its ceremony alone, the way nature so often does its most extraordinary things, without audience, without announcement, in the patient company of its own silence. Let that image rest with you for a moment. Somewhere right now, in a desert you'll never visit, a stone may be moving, 1 inch, 2 inches, leaving its soft trail in the mud. The stars above it are brilliant and indifferent and beautiful. The ice around it is thinning in the morning sun, and the stone goes where it goes, as it has always gone, as it will always go, long after tonight, long after all our questions have been answered and forgotten and asked again. If this story is helping you relax tonight, we'd gently encourage you to like the video. It helps more people find their way to this quiet place. And if you haven't already, our playlist has many more slow, peaceful nature stories just like this one, waiting for you whenever you need them. There is a particular quality to desert silence that is different from any other kind of silence. Forest silence has texture to it. Leaves moving, birds shifting in branches, the very soft sound of something alive and breathing all around you. Ocean silence is never really silence at all, just the low, constant conversation of water with itself. Mountain silence is clean and thin, and sometimes it makes your ears ring gently, as though your hearing is reaching out and finding nothing to hold on to. But desert silence is something else. It is complete. It is a silence that feels as though it has been here for a very long time, and is not in any hurry to be interrupted. Standing in the middle of a playa on a still day, you might hear your own heartbeat. You might hear the blood in your own ears. The world outside yourself becomes so quiet that the world inside becomes briefly, surprisingly audible. This is the silence that surrounds the sliding stones. Let's rest here for a while in that silence. Let the story come quietly, without rushing. The ice panels that carry the stones, those thin, fragile sheets of winter ice floating on shallow desert water, are not all the same size. Some are small, the size of a dinner plate. Others are enormous, stretching for dozens of yards across the playa in a single continuous sheet before they crack and separate. The larger the ice panel, the more wind it can catch, and the more stones it can carry at once. This is why sometimes you see parallel trails on the playa, 2 or 3 stones that move together at the same pace, in the same direction, because they were all passengers on the same ice panel. They traveled as a group without knowing it. And when the ice melted, they rested as a group, their trails running alongside each other like quiet roads through an empty country. The speed at which the stones move is almost impossible to imagine as movement. The fastest recorded speeds for these sliding stones are around 1 meter per minute during active periods, about the pace of a very slow walk. But most of the time they move far slower than that. During a single winter event, a stone might travel only a few feet total. Its 100-foot trail represents dozens of such events, accumulated over many years, many winters, many thin layers of ice. Time in the desert moves differently, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that the desert reminds you of time as it actually is, not the rushed, divided, urgent time of everyday life, but deep time, geological time, the kind of time in which a stone crossing a dry lake bed is not slow at all, but simply moving at the pace that stones move, which is exactly right. The playa mud itself tells time in its own way. The cracked surface of a dried playa, those beautiful, irregular polygons of dried clay, form through a process called desiccation cracking. As the wet mud dries and shrinks, it pulls apart along lines of weakness, and the cracks that form tend to meet at roughly right angles, creating a pattern that looks almost deliberate, almost architectural. Each crack is a record of a drying, a record of rain and sun, and the slow breath of evaporation. Some playa surfaces are very old. The cracks in them have dried and re-wetted many times, and each cycle adds subtle layers of information to the surface. Tiny ridges, faint discolorations, the ghost marks of old water lines. You could spend hours simply looking at the ground on a playa and find it endlessly varied, endlessly interesting, a landscape in miniature. The stones that rest on this surface carry their own stories in their texture. Pick up, again, only in imagination, only in the soft museum of this story, a piece of the dark dolomite that falls from the mountains around Racetrack Playa. It is heavy for its size, dense with minerals laid down in ancient ocean sediments when this part of California was covered by a shallow inland sea, some 750 million years ago. The stone in your hand is 750 million years old. The desert around you is young by comparison. Holding something that old, if you can really let yourself feel it, produces a very specific kind of calm. It's the calm of perspective. Your worries, whatever they are tonight, are real and valid and worth attending to. But they are also very, very recent. The stone does not know them. The stone has been through ice ages and the rise and fall of mountains and the coming and going of oceans. And now it is here on a quiet playa, sliding slowly toward no particular destination. And it is entirely fine. You are also entirely fine. The mountains that supply the stones to Racetrack Playa are called the Cottonwood Mountains to the north and the Last Chance Range to the south and east. These names have a lovely, worn-out poetry to them. The names of places that have been looked at from a distance by tired and thirsty travelers and named with whatever words were closest to hand. Last Chance, Cottonwood. They are old names for old places, and the mountains themselves are older still. From the playa floor, you can see these mountains on all sides, dark and ridged and very still against the pale sky. They don't appear close. Nothing appears close in the desert, where the air is so clear that distances are hard to judge, and things that seem near turn out to be miles away. The mountains simply float there at the edges of the world, purple in the evening, black at night, gray in the early morning, patient witnesses to everything that happens on the flat ground below. Birds sometimes cross the playa. Not many. It offers very little in the way of food or shelter. But occasionally a raven will appear, flying with that particular raven purposefulness, going somewhere definite and known only to itself. Ravens are intelligent birds, curious and observant, and when one lands on the playa, it will walk for a while on the cracked surface, tilting its head, examining things. Perhaps it has noticed the stone trails. Perhaps it finds them as puzzling and interesting as we do. There are also occasional tracks of coyotes crossing the playa at night, recorded in the mud, soft, four-toed impressions that tell of a quiet transit. A coyote crossing this open space in the dark, neither hurrying nor dawdling, simply passing through on the way to somewhere else. The playa records these visits the same way it records the stone trails, patiently, without judgment, without urgency. In the early morning sometimes, a thin mist sits on the playa surface. The cold night air and the slightly less cold morning air meet above the shallow water, and the water vapor rises in a transparent curtain, not thick enough to obscure anything, just thick enough to soften the edges of stones and mountains and make the whole landscape look like a memory of itself, like something seen through frosted glass. In this mist, the stone trails are especially beautiful, long, soft lines running into the distance, disappearing gradually into the pale air, suggesting travel without showing its destination. You could stand at one end of a trail and look along its length and feel the pull of it, the gentle invitation to follow. to go where the stone went, to walk slowly in the wake of something patient and unhurried. Some trails on the playa are so old that they are partly erased. Rain and wind and the re-wetting of the surface have softened their edges, filled them slightly, turned a crisp groove into a gentle suggestion. These oldest trails are the most beautiful. They are the ones the stone made long ago when it was young to this playa. Young meaning perhaps only a few centuries on the valley floor, having spent the previous hundreds of millions of years inside a mountain. The playa holds all these trails together, the sharp and fresh, the soft and old, the way a book holds all its pages together, not distinguishing between the ones written first and the ones written last, giving them all the same gentle cover, the same quiet binding. Rest your eyes now if you like. Let the image of the playa come to you, pale and flat and enormous, threaded with those gentle lines, the mountains floating at the edges, one raven crossing slowly overhead. There's a stone resting somewhere out there, having arrived at wherever it's arrived at for now, perfectly content. It will move again or it won't, and either way is fine. Check our playlist if you haven't already. There are so many other quiet places waiting for you there, other stories of patient and beautiful things moving slowly through a slow and beautiful world. Night comes to the desert in stages. First, the sun touches the top of the western mountains and catches there for a while, staining them deep red and amber, while everything below falls into gentle shadow. The playa, already in shade, cools quickly. You can almost feel it, the way a stone held in your hand cools when you set it down. The temperature drops and the air thickens slightly with the faint smell of warm dust and dry rock, a smell that is somehow both ancient and clean. Then the last red light leaves the mountain peaks, and for a few minutes everything is the same soft gray blue, as though the world has been gently watercolored. This is the time called civil twilight, and it is one of the most peaceful times of any day anywhere, but especially in the desert, where there are no streetlights to hurry it along, no neon to compete with it. And then the stars begin, not all at once. They appear quietly, one by one, the brightest ones first, like shy guests arriving early to a gathering. Venus, usually, burning steadily in the west. Then Jupiter somewhere else on the arc of sky. Then more and more and more, until the whole dome above is completely alive with light. The Milky Way pouring across it from horizon to horizon in a river of soft, unresolvable brilliance. The sliding stones of Racetrack Playa have been doing their slow traveling under skies like this for thousands of years. Let's stay here in the night for a while and let more of their quiet story find us. The temperature on a clear desert night drops dramatically. This is one of the defining characteristics of desert climates. Without the insulating blanket of humidity and cloud cover that keeps temperate places warmer after dark, the desert radiates its heat directly into space. On a winter night at Racetrack Playa, temperatures can drop to well below freezing, sometimes reaching -10 or 15 degrees Celsius. The cold arrives quickly and completely, and by midnight, the playa is very still and very cold and very beautiful. It is in this cold that the thin ice forms. Watch it form now in your mind's eye, as though you were there with a very slow, very patient camera. The water on the playa, that shallow winter lake only an inch or two deep, begins to lose heat from its surface upward into the cold, clear sky. The surface cools first, and at the freezing point, the water molecules slow their movement and begin to link together, forming the six-sided lattice structures of ice crystals. At first, it's just a thin skin, barely there, translucent, trembling slightly when the wind touches it. Then thicker, then firmer, then continuous. A single sheet of ice covering the whole shallow lake. The process takes hours. If you were lying on the ground beside the playa, watching it happen, which would be extremely cold and would not be recommended, but let's imagine it. You might not see the ice forming at all. You would just notice after some time that the water had stopped reflecting the stars with perfect clarity and had begun to reflect them with a slight, still crystalline sheen instead. The stars in the ice look slightly different from the stars in the water, more fixed, more final. Ice has a remarkable property that is actually quite unusual in nature. It is less dense than liquid water, which is why it floats. Most substances are denser in their solid form, but water is different, and this difference is enormously important for life on Earth. If ice sank instead of floating, lakes would freeze from the bottom up, killing everything in them. Instead, ice floats, creating an insulating layer that protects the water below and the life below through winter. On the playa, this floating ice is what makes the stone sliding possible. It floats on the shallow water, above the mud, above the stones. And when it breaks into panels and the wind moves those panels, the edges of the ice push against the stones and carry them along. The force required to move a stone across the wet mud is surprisingly modest, far less than you might think. When mud is saturated with water, it becomes extraordinarily slippery. The friction between a smooth stone bottom and saturated mud is very low. This is why even large stones can be moved by the relatively gentle force of ice panels driven by light winds. The mud cooperates. It offers no resistance. It simply allows. There's a metaphor there if you want one. Or you can simply enjoy the fact of it. The mud being generous with its slipperiness, the ice being patient with its pushing, the stone going willingly where it is taken, the whole system working together in a way that requires no effort and no intention from any of its parts. The wind that moves the ice panels at Racetrack Playa typically comes from the south, which is why many of the stone trails on the playa run roughly north. But the wind is not consistent. It shifts. It gusts gently. It pauses and begins again. And those variations are recorded in the curves of the trails. Each subtle bend a record of a moment when the wind changed its mind slightly, or when the ice panel rotated on the water, or when the stone encountered a slightly different texture of mud. every curve and every trail is a small autobiography, a record of conditions that existed for a few moments in a particular winter, in a particular hour of a particular night, in a place that very few people have ever visited, and even fewer have watched carefully. These are the smallest possible histories, written in the quietest possible medium, read by almost no one. And yet, they are there. They have always been there. They will continue to be there, being written by stones and ice and wind, for as long as the winters come and the water arrives and the temperatures drop. The playa does not need anyone to read its histories, but it doesn't mind that we do. Other interesting things live in the desert around Racetrack Playa, even in this apparently barren landscape. Desert plants are masters of waiting. Many of them spend most of the year as seeds, lying dormant in the dry soil, containing within their tiny cases all the information needed to grow and flower and set more seed, waiting only for water. When winter rains come, these seeds germinate quickly, sending out roots and shoots with a speed that seems almost urgent for something so small and patient. The flowers that follow a desert rain are legendary for their beauty and their brevity. They bloom within days of the rain and last only a week or two before the returning dryness ends them. But while they last, they color the desert floor in yellows and purples and pale whites, a temporary and extraordinary generosity. None of these flowers grow on the playa itself, where the alkaline soil and the lack of shelter make life too difficult, even for these hardy plants. But around the edges, in the rougher ground, where soil has accumulated in the shelter of rocks, you might find the smallest and toughest of desert plants, a few blades of something dried but still technically alive, a low mat of some gray-green succulent lying close to the ground to escape the wind. These plants are very old. Some desert plants, particularly the creosote bushes that grow throughout the American Southwest, are among the oldest living organisms on Earth. A single creosote bush can clone itself repeatedly, the original plant dying, but sending out new growth from its roots, so that the ring of plants you see around a bare central patch is actually one continuous organism that has been living and growing for 10,000 years or more. 10,000 years of small, waxy, aromatic leaves. 10,000 years of yellow flowers appearing briefly after rain. 10,000 years of patience. The sliding stones have been moving for much less time than that. In geological terms, they are young, but in human terms, they have been moving since long before anyone came to watch them, since long before anyone knew what a dry lake bed was or what to call the mountains around one, since before there were words for any of this. Let yourself feel the depth of that for a moment, gently, without strain. You are here now in the comfortable warmth of wherever you are tonight, and out there in the dark desert, a stone is perhaps at this very moment beginning the first inches of a journey that will take years to complete. And you know about it. And it is peaceful. Drop your shoulders one more time. Breathe slowly. We'll keep going together, you and this story, as slowly as you need. The science of sliding stones has its own gentle history, and like all good histories, it contains people. There was a geologist named Jim McAllister who first wrote about the mysterious stone trails of racetrack playa in the 1940s, describing them with careful wonder in his field notes. He was mapping the geology of Death Valley, a practical task, measuring and recording. And when he came across the playa and its trailing stones, he wrote about them with the careful excitement of a scientist who has found something that doesn't fit neatly into any existing category. He didn't know what made the stones move. He simply recorded that they did. After McAllister, other scientists came. A pair of researchers named Tar and Caroline studied the playa in the 1950s. Then, in the 1970s, two geologists named Bob Sharp and Dwight Carey began a long and devoted study that would last 8 years. They named the stones. This is the detail that makes the whole enterprise feel most human. They named them. The stones of racetrack playa, at least the ones being studied, had names. There was a stone called Karen, a stone called Mary Ann, a stone called Claudia. These names were given not from sentimentality, but from practical necessity. To track individual stones over years of observation, you needed to be able to refer to them consistently. But there's something lovely about it anyway. Something that makes these lumps of ancient rock feel briefly like characters in a story, which in a way they are. Karen traveled nearly 200 feet in the first year of the study. Claudia moved 300 feet over several years, in a path that curved to the right. One stone, a large and heavy one, barely moved at all during the entire 8 years study. Another traveled so far and with such apparent consistency that the researchers could almost predict where it would go next. Sharp and Carey eventually concluded that wind was the primary moving force acting on ice. They were mostly right. The complete picture took decades more to arrive, but their patient, careful fieldwork over those 8 years, returning season after season to measure and record, to note which stones had moved and in what direction, to try to correlate stone movement with weather records, was the kind of science that is also a kind of devotion. You can think of scientific devotion as a type of quiet love, not the dramatic love of stories and songs, but the steady love of returning to the same place year after year, because it contains a question that matters to you. The way someone might return to a beloved lake or a favorite hillside, not because anything dramatic happens there, but because it is theirs, and it gives them something that nowhere else quite gives. Death Valley itself is a place that inspires this kind of devotion in the people who come to know it. At first, it seems harsh and inhospitable, and in some ways it is. It holds the record for the highest reliably recorded air temperature on Earth, 134 degrees Fahrenheit, on a summer afternoon in 1913. In summer, it is genuinely difficult for human beings. But in winter and spring, and in the early mornings and evenings, even in summer, it reveals itself as one of the most layered and interesting and beautiful landscapes in the world. The valley floor sits below sea level, 282 feet below at its lowest point. Around it, mountains rise to heights of over 11,000 feet. This extraordinary difference in elevation, all within a relatively small area, creates a range of ecosystems stacked on top of each other. The salt flats and gravel plains of the valley floor, the sparse desert scrub of the lower slopes, the pinyon pine forests of the middle elevations, the subalpine zones near the peaks. You could, in a single day's drive, go from below the sea to near the snow line, passing through completely different worlds. Racetrack Playa sits in the middle elevations of this stacked landscape, high enough for winter ice, low enough for summer warmth, perfectly positioned to make possible the thing that makes it famous. The road to Racetrack Playa is unpaved and rough, a long, slow drive over a corrugated gravel surface that requires patience and a sturdy vehicle. This difficulty of access is part of what protects it. Not many people make the journey. Those who do tend to approach it with a certain quiet seriousness, having already committed so much time and effort to getting there. When you finally emerge from the mountains onto the playa's edge, the effect is sudden and profound. The flat openness after miles of narrow canyon road is startling. The scale of it is hard to take in. You stop the car and step out, and the silence is immediate and total, and the playa stretches away from you in every direction with a completeness that makes your usual thoughts feel, briefly, irrelevant. In this landscape, the sliding stones are not remarkable. They fit. They belong. They are exactly the right thing to find in exactly this kind of place. A quiet mystery in a quiet landscape. Something that takes time to understand. Something that rewards patience and close attention and the willingness to return more than once. The stones themselves, when you find them, are often anticlimactic in the best possible way. They are just stones. Dark, rough, ordinary-looking stones sitting on pale mud. Their trails are the extraordinary thing. Those long, quiet lines running back across the surface, recording journeys you didn't witness, telling stories in a language of pressure and patience that takes a while to learn to read. But once you learn to read it, you see it everywhere, in the way rivers carve canyons over millions of years, in the way glaciers leave scratches in bedrock as they move over it, in the way roots split rocks slowly over decades, not pushing hard, but simply growing persistently and gently into whatever space presents itself. The sliding stones of the playa are part of a much larger grammar, a language that the earth uses to describe its own slow, enormous, patient life. If you're still here with us and feeling restful, why not let someone else know about this channel? A friend who needs a quiet evening, a family member who has trouble sleeping. These stories are here for anyone who needs them. And don't forget, you can find many more in our playlist. Already waiting, already quiet, already full of gentle things. Let's talk about light on the playa. It deserves its own space in this story. At dawn, when the first gray begins to separate sky from mountain on the eastern horizon, the playa goes through a transformation so slow and so beautiful that it could hold your attention for hours if you were there to watch it. The gray deepens and warms to a pale gold. The mountains catch the light on their highest faces. The playa surface, still holding some of the night's frost, begins to glitter, not dramatically, not blindingly, but with a soft, distributed sparkle, as though someone had folded a handful of stars into the mud overnight. This frost sparkle is ice crystals on the surface of the playa, tiny, perfect, six-sided structures of frozen water catching the new light. By mid-morning, they will be gone, melted by the rising sun without ceremony. But for those few minutes at dawn, the playa floor is alive with this quiet, frozen light, and the stones sit in the middle of it, looking ancient and at peace. Light in the desert has a quality that painters have spent centuries trying to capture. It's to do with the clarity of the air. Desert air carries very little moisture, very little dust under normal conditions, and so light travels through it without the softening and diffusing that happens in more humid places. Shadows in the desert are sharp-edged, colors are saturated. Every rock and crack and stone trail casts a precise shadow that moves visibly with the sun, so that the whole landscape tells time if you know how to read it. The stone trails on the playa also play with light. Seen from one direction, a trail can be almost invisible, just a shallow groove in the pale surface, not deep enough to catch much shadow. Seen from another direction, with the light coming along its length, the same trail springs into definition, the raised edges catching the sun, and the groove itself in shadow, the whole line of it suddenly clear and legible across the long flat ground. This is why photographers who visit Racetrack Playa go in the early morning or late afternoon, when the light comes in at an angle and the trails become most visible. Midday light coming straight down flattens everything, but angled light, the light of early and late, the gentle light, reveals what the land has been doing. There is a lesson in this too, though we are not here for lessons tonight, only for rest and for the quiet pleasure of noticing things. The geological composition of the playa floor is worth knowing about because it's beautiful in its own quiet way. The mud that makes up the surface is called clay. Specifically, a type of clay mineral called smectite, which has the property of expanding significantly when wet and shrinking considerably when dry. This expansion and contraction, repeated over and over with each wetting and drying cycle, is what creates those characteristic cracked polygons on the playa surface. Smectite clay also has another property that's relevant to the sliding stones. When it is fully saturated with water, it becomes extraordinarily smooth and frictionless. The water molecules arrange themselves between the clay particles in a way that allows them to slide past each other with almost no resistance. This is the mud at its most cooperative, its most yielding, and it is this yielding that allows stones to travel. The word schmectite comes from the Greek word for soap because of this slippery, smooth quality. There is something pleasing about this. Ancient clay, named for ancient soap, the most ordinary and domestic of materials. The stuff that makes the desert floors so beautiful and strange is named for something you might find beside your bathroom sink. Far away from racetrack playa in different deserts on different continents, similar playa lake beds have been found to contain their own sliding stones. In Argentina, in the high-altitude desert of the Andes, there is a playa where the stones move. The conditions are slightly different: higher altitude, different mineral composition in the rocks and mud, different weather patterns. But the essential story is the same: ice, wind, thin sheets of winter water, patient stones, long trails. The Andean playa sits at nearly 14,000 feet above sea level in an area called the Puna de Atacama, a high-altitude desert plateau shared by Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. At that altitude, the air is thin enough to make you breathe carefully, and the sky is such a deep shade of blue that it looks almost violet. The cold is intense and comes quickly at night, and the stones there have been sliding too, in their own quiet way, observed by almost no one. In Spain, in the Tabernus Desert, sometimes called the only true desert in Europe, there are dried lake beds that show signs of stone movement, though the trails there are less dramatic than those at Racetrack Playa because the conditions for sliding are less perfect. But they are there, small records of small journeys waiting to be read. This global distribution of sliding stones is quietly comforting. The phenomenon is not a local curiosity, a single strange quirk of one particular place. It is a pattern, a thing that the natural world does in certain conditions, whenever those conditions are met, regardless of which country the desert belongs to or what language is spoken in the nearest town. Continue at its own pace, carrying you. Continue at its own pace, carrying you along the way. The ice carries the stones gently, without strain, toward wherever rest is waiting. Among all the stones of Racetrack Playa, there is one that has become something like famous. It is called the Grandstand Stone, though this name refers more to a large rock formation near the northern end of the playa, a dark, jagged island of rock rising from the flat white surface like a small, ancient castle, or like the ruins of something enormous that happened here a very long time ago. The grandstand is made of quartz monzonite, a coarse-grained igneous rock speckled with crystals of feldspar and quartz and dark mica. It is very old. It has been standing in the middle of what was once a lake for thousands of years. The grandstand is not one of the sliding stones. It is far too large and far too deeply anchored to move, but it gives a sense of scale to the playa, something tall and solid to set the eye against the flatness, a reference point from which everything else can be measured. Standing near the grandstand and looking south across the playa, you can see the full extent of the space, the mountains on all sides, the pale surface running away into the distance, the tiny dark shapes of individual sliding stones scattered here and there across the ground. From this vantage point, the playa looks like a room, a very large room with no ceiling, floored in pale clay, lit by the sky, with stones arranged upon it like objects set out for some purpose that you can almost, but not quite, identify. Rocks from the Cottonwood Mountains, which form the northern boundary of the playa, are the source of most of the sliding stones. These mountains are made of dark dolomite and limestone, sedimentary rocks originally laid down as sediments at the bottom of a shallow inland sea that covered this part of California hundreds of millions of years ago. Over geological time, these seafloor sediments were buried, compressed, uplifted by tectonic forces, folded and faulted, and eventually exposed at the surface as mountain ranges. And then, over much shorter time scales, thousands of years rather than hundreds of millions, rain and frost and the slow chemistry of weathering began to break pieces loose from the mountains. Rocks split along their natural planes of weakness. Pieces fell and rolled, and some of those pieces ended up on the playa, where they have been doing their slow traveling ever since. The connection between those ancient seafloor sediments and these present-day sliding stones is almost dizzying if you follow it all the way through. The stone sliding across the playa right now was once sediment at the bottom of an ocean that no longer exists, in a world that looked completely different, inhabited by creatures that left no descendants. Everything has changed, and yet the stone is still here, still made of the same calcium carbonate crystals it was always made of, still dark, still dense, now simply occupying a different role in a different landscape. This is deep time again, arriving quietly at the edges of the story. You don't have to hold it all in your mind. Just let it pass through, the way a cool breeze passes through, touching everything briefly, changing the temperature by a degree, and moving on. The very flatness of the playa is itself a geological story. When the ancient lake that filled this basin evaporated or drained, the process that ended the lake was gradual over thousands of years. As the climate became drier at the end of the last ice age, it left behind its sediments in a perfectly flat layer. Water, by its nature, seeks its own level, and sediments deposited in water follow that level. The result is a surface as flat as anything made by human hands, sometimes flatter, leveled by physics and chemistry and the patient patience of water. On Racetrack Playa, this flatness is so perfect that the variation in elevation across the entire 2-mile length of the playa is only a few inches over 2 miles. If you stood at one end and held a perfectly level instrument, the far end of the playa would be at almost exactly the same elevation as the near end. This flatness is not just visually striking, it is structurally important. A perfectly flat surface ensures that when the thin winter lake forms, it covers the entire playa evenly, allowing the ice to form uniformly across the whole surface. If the playa had even a slight slope, the water would be deeper at one end and shallower at the other. The deeper water would take longer to freeze. The shallower water would evaporate faster. The conditions for stone sliding would be less consistent, less reliable, less perfectly calibrated. The flatness is part of the system. The water made the flat surface, and the flat surface makes the water work, and the water makes the ice, and the ice moves the stones, and the stones leave their trails in the surface that the water made flat. It is a circle of causes so neatly arranged that it seems designed, though nothing designed it. It simply is. In the evenings at Racetrack Playa, when the last daylight is fading and the temperature is already dropping, the air sometimes moves in slow, large waves. Not gusts, not wind exactly, but a circulation, a breathing as the cold air from the mountains drains down the slopes and across the playa floor toward the valley below. You can feel it on your face as a very gentle, very cool movement, barely enough to stir dust. It is exactly this kind of gentle, steady wind that is believed to drive the ice panels that carry the stones, not the powerful desert wind that roars and creates sandstorms. That wind would shatter the ice. This quieter, steadier, cooler wind is patient enough to push without breaking, strong enough to move without forcing, sustained enough to carry a stone a few feet in the time it blows before resting. The gentleness is what makes it possible. We find this again and again in nature. The most effective forces are not always the strongest ones. The most effective forces are often the most persistent ones, the most patient ones, the ones that don't announce themselves with drama, but simply continue day after day and year after year, until the mountain has worn down, or the stone has crossed the playa, or the canyon has been carved through solid rock. Gentleness and time. These are the great tools. You might drop your jaw slightly now. Let your tongue rest soft in your mouth. Let your eyes, if they are still reading, go soft behind the words. The story will still be here. The playa will still be here. The stones will still be crossing their slow distances. If you're finding this restful, do leave us a little comment below, even just to say you were here tonight, that you let yourself be still for a while. It means a lot to know these quiet words are reaching someone. Rain in the desert is an event, not in the way that rain in a forest is an event. In a forest, rain is familiar, expected, the natural completion of a cycle that happens so often it becomes almost unremarkable. But in the desert, where months may pass without a drop of moisture, rain arrives as something else entirely, something that changes the whole character of the air from the moment the first clouds begin to build on the horizon. You can smell a desert rainstorm from miles away. The rain falls through hot, dry air before it reaches the ground. And as it falls, it releases volatile compounds from the desert soil, geosmin from the soil bacteria, oils from the resinous desert plants, minerals from the dust. And these compounds rise upward on the cooling air currents ahead of the storm and arrive before the rain does. This smell is called petrichor, from the Greek words for stone and the fluid that flows through the veins of the gods. And It is one of the most universally loved smells in the human sensory vocabulary. If you know this smell, let it come to you now, in memory. That first cool breath before rain, that promise in the air. Breathe it in gently. Desert rain comes with its own distinctive light. The clouds that produce it are often tall and dramatic. Cumulonimbus towers building up over the mountains in the afternoon heat, and they cast dramatic shadows and dramatic illumination on the landscape below. A shaft of rain falling from a dark cloud lit by the late sun behind you can glow like a curtain of gold. The desert beneath, still pale and dry except where the rain is falling, provides a contrast that makes the rain itself look almost impossibly vivid. On racetrack playa, winter rain is the important kind. Summer rain does arrive occasionally. These are called monsoon rains, driven by seasonal wind shift that bring moisture up from the Gulf of California. But summer rain evaporates quickly from the hot ground. Winter rain falls on a cooler surface, evaporates more slowly, and has time to collect in that thin sheet that sets the whole stone-moving process in motion. A winter rainstorm on the playa typically lasts a few hours at most. The clouds move through, the rain falls, and then the clouds move on, and the sky clears to that extraordinary desert blue. A blue so deep and saturated it looks almost artificial, the kind of blue you can fall into if you look at it long enough. The playa surface, freshly wet, reflects this sky back perfectly, so that for a while the playa and the sky become confused, both equally blue, equally vast, the flat ground and the infinite sky exchanging identities. The shallow lake that forms after winter rain is called an ephemeral lake, which is a gentle and rather beautiful term. Ephemeral means lasting only a short time, from the Greek for lasting only a day, though in practice these desert lakes may last weeks or months before evaporating completely. During that time, they are real lakes, small, shallow, still, but real. They reflect the sky. They freeze on cold nights. They support the stone sliding process, and then they are gone. In their brief existence, these ephemeral lakes can support surprising amounts of life. Desert shrimp, tiny crustaceans called fairy shrimp or tadpole shrimp, have evolved to survive in exactly these temporary conditions. Their eggs can lie dormant in the dry desert soil for years, even decades, waiting for water. When the rain comes and the ephemeral lake forms, the eggs hatch within hours. The shrimp grow, mate, and lay new eggs before the lake dries up, completing their entire life cycle in the few weeks of the lake's existence. On racetrack playa, conditions may be too alkaline and too extreme for even these hardy creatures. But in other ephemeral desert lakes nearby, fairy shrimp appear reliably. After every sufficient rain, these tiny transparent animals moving through the shallow water with their rhythmic, feathery swimming motion, going about their urgent and complete little lives while the water lasts. There is something quietly profound about an animal that has evolved to live an entire life in the time it takes a temporary lake to evaporate. It is a different relationship with time than we have. Everything that we experience as long a week, a month, a season, is an entire existence for the fairy shrimp. It is neither fast nor slow from the inside. It is simply life, at whatever pace life happens. The sliding stones, by contrast, move through a different temporal scale entirely. A stone that crosses the playa over 50 years of winters is operating in human scale time. 50 years is within a human lifetime, something a person could observe from beginning to end if they were devoted enough. And yet, the stone is also operating in geological time, its mineral structure unchanged since it was laid down in ancient ocean sediments hundreds of millions of years ago. Its journey across the playa, a tiny incident in a story that began long before anything like us existed. These different scales of time all exist simultaneously, all happening at once, all occurring in the same desert under the same stars. The fairy shrimp completes its life in weeks. The person spends decades. The stone crosses the playa over centuries. The mountain erodes over millions of years. And the stars above, in their own time scale, live and die over billions. All of it at once. All of it right now. This is not a frightening thought, though it might sound like it could be. It is actually a very calming one, if you let yourself settle into it. You are here, now, in exactly the moment, and at exactly the scale that you are. That is the only place you could be. That is the only scale that applies to you. Everything else, the fairy shrimp's quick life, the stone's slow crossing, the mountain's long patience, is simply other expressions of the same universe, doing what it does at whatever pace it does it. And right now, the universe is doing this. It is quiet. It is dark, or nearly dark, where you are. There is a blanket, perhaps, and the sound of nothing much, and a story about stones. This is enough. This is more than enough. Let's talk about the people who live near the deserts where the stones slide, and the stories those people tell. Native American peoples have lived in and around Death Valley for thousands of years. The Timbisha Shoshone, whose name for themselves means people of the red rock paint, have called this landscape home since before the last great ice age ended, since before the ephemeral lakes completely dried up, since the time when Death Valley was a very different kind of place, wetter, cooler, full of life, that has since retreated or vanished. The Timbisha Shoshone know this land in a way that can only come from many generations of close attention. They know which plants bloom after which rains. They know where water can be found in the driest months. They know the rhythms of the desert across a whole year, a whole lifetime, a whole cultural memory that goes back further than written records. Whether the Timbisha Shoshone have their own explanations for the sliding stones, I don't know with certainty, and it would be wrong to invent one. What we can say is that a people who have lived so long in this landscape surely noticed the stone trails, surely walked across the playa and saw the long lines running from stone to stone, surely wondered in their own way about what moved them. Indigenous peoples around the world often develop explanations for natural phenomena that, while not identical to scientific explanations, capture something true about the relationship between that phenomenon and the larger world. The sliding stones are the kind of thing that invites story. They are the kind of thing that makes you feel that the world is more alive and more interesting than it appeared before you knew about them. Far from Death Valley, in the desert regions of Central Australia, the Aboriginal peoples of the Western Desert have maintained living relationships with their landscapes for tens of thousands of years, the longest continuous cultural traditions on Earth. Their relationship with rocks and stones is deep and multifaceted, encoded in songlines and stories and ceremonial knowledge. In that tradition, the land itself is alive, has memory, has story woven into it. Every rock and waterhole and mountain has its history, its place in a larger narrative. This is a different way of knowing the world than the scientific way, and the two are not necessarily in conflict. They ask different questions. Science asks how. Traditional knowledge asks what it means, what it connects to, what our responsibilities are in relation to it. Both are ways of paying close attention. Both arise from the same fundamental human impulse, to see the world clearly and to be in right relationship with it. The sliding stones of racetrack playa are, in a sense, an object that rewards both kinds of attention. The scientific story, ice panels, wind, saturated clay, is elegant and satisfying and explains the mechanism completely, but it doesn't exhaust the experience of standing in front of a 100-foot trail left by a stone that moved while no one watched. That experience requires something else alongside the mechanism. A feeling of quiet wonder, a sense that the world is full of things that have been happening without us, that will continue to happen without us, that do not require our observation to be real and complete and significant. In the 1990s, a man named Philip Ranney spent considerable time at Racetrack Playa, documenting the stones and their trails in photographs. His images capture something that photographs of this place always seem to capture: a deep, aching spaciousness, the pale ground stretching to the dark mountains, the dark stones resting in pools of their own thin shadow, the trails running away into the distance like the most minimal possible roads, roads going nowhere in particular, roads that exist only because something was moved. Looking at photographs of the playa at night, starlit, the stones barely visible as dark shapes against the slightly less dark ground, you feel the full force of the silence. The stars are very numerous and very high. The playa is very flat and very wide, and the stones are just there, small and solid and real, going about their business of being stones in a very cold, very quiet place. This is enough for tonight. You don't need to understand everything about a thing to let it comfort you. The stones don't understand their own sliding. The ice doesn't understand its own forming. The wind doesn't know it is being gentle. And yet, all of it works together beautifully, producing something that we, with our self-aware and wondering minds, can find beautiful and strange and calming. Our playlist has many more of these quiet explorations. other natural mysteries told slowly, other beautiful places visited in words before sleep. We'd love for you to find one that calls to you. The color of the rocks at Racetrack Playa is worth dwelling on for a while. Most of the sliding stones are dark, almost black, in the low light of dawn or dusk. This darkness comes from the mineral dolomite, which is a carbonate rock containing both calcium and magnesium, and which tends to weather to a very dark gray or near black on its surfaces. Freshly broken dolomite is a bit lighter, more gray, but the exterior faces of rocks that have been exposed to desert weathering for years acquire what geologists call a desert varnish, a thin coating of iron and manganese oxides that accumulates on exposed rock surfaces over very long periods, creating a dark, almost metallic sheen. Desert varnish is very old, and it accumulates very slowly, just a few millimeters over thousands of years. The fact that the sliding stones carry desert varnish on their upper and side surfaces tells you that these stones have been sitting on the playa for a very long time, long enough for the slow chemistry of varnish to coat them. Thousands of years at least. Ancient peoples in various desert regions of the world used this rock varnish as a writing surface. By scratching through the dark varnish to the lighter rock below, they created images that are now called petroglyphs, animals, geometric patterns, human figures, symbols that carry meanings now mostly lost to time. These images can last for thousands of years on varnished rock surfaces, the protective coating of varnish helping to preserve them against the slow erosion that would otherwise wear them away. There are no petroglyphs on the sliding stones of Racetrack Playa. The stones are small and mobile and clearly unsuitable as permanent writing surfaces. But the presence of desert varnish on them connects them to this wider tradition of rock surfaces carrying memory, carrying mark, carrying the record of things that passed by them. The playa floor itself is pale, white to light tan, depending on the angle and quality of the light. This paleness comes from the minerals left behind when the ancient lake evaporated. When water evaporates from a lake, it leaves behind everything that was dissolved in it. The salts, the carbonates, the sulfates that the water picked up during its journey through the surrounding rock and soil. Over thousands of years of repeated filling and evaporating, a playa accumulates a layer of these white minerals at the surface, which gives it that characteristic bright, clean appearance. The contrast between the dark stones and the pale surface is part of what makes the playa so visually striking. Dark shapes on a light ground. The stones are visible from some distance, and their trails, the grooves they leave in the pale clay, are also visible, though more subtly, catching the light differently from the undisturbed surface around them. If you were a bird flying slowly over the playa at a moderate height, the whole surface would resolve into a map of stone movements. Every trail would be legible. The patterns they make, taken together, would show you the prevailing wind direction. Most trails run roughly north, the consistency of that wind, many trails are roughly parallel, and the occasional anomalies, the stones that curved, the stones that stopped and started, the stones that seemed to have reversed direction slightly before resuming their journey. From above, the playa would look like a very slow, very calm river delta. All those channels running the same general direction, occasionally diverging, occasionally meeting, the whole surface marked by the evidence of movement in a thing that appears completely still. Birds do fly over the playa, though they don't linger. It offers nothing for them. No food, no water, no shelter. They cross it and continue to the mountains beyond. Occasionally a hawk circles above it, riding a thermal, a rising column of warm air created when the sun heats the pale surface. And from the hawk's circling height, the playa is spread out below like a pale page. Wind patterns over the playa are influenced by the mountains on all sides. The mountains create their own local air circulation, warming in the day and drawing air in from the surrounding areas, cooling at night and sending cold air draining downward across the playa floor. These reliable local wind patterns are part of why the stone trails are so consistently oriented. The stones are responding to a wind that the landscape itself creates, a wind shaped by the particular arrangement of mountains and flat land that exists in this particular place. In this sense, the sliding stones are a product of the whole landscape, not just of the playa. The mountains create the local wind. The wind creates the ice movement. The ice movement creates the trails. The stones, the ice, the wind, the mountains, all parts of one system, all in conversation with each other in their slow, wordless way. Systems like this are everywhere in nature once you start to see them. The coral reef is a system, fish and coral and algae and water chemistry, all in constant negotiation with each other. The forest is a system, trees and fungi and bacteria and insects and birds all interwoven. The playa is a smaller, quieter system, but no less intricate for its quietness. Let yourself be part of a system tonight, the system of this room, this bed, this blanket, this breath, this story, this gentle darkness. All the parts working together to bring you toward rest. There are nights at Racetrack Playa when the wind stops entirely. This is not uncommon in the desert. Weather in desert environments can be dramatic. Strong winds, sudden temperature drops, brief intense rains. But it can also be utterly still. And the stillest nights in the desert are something extraordinary. On a completely still night, with no wind at all, the temperature continues to drop steadily as the desert radiates its heat into the clear sky above. The cold is clean and complete. Your breath makes a small cloud when you exhale, and then the cloud disperses and there is no trace that you breathed. The stars are so numerous and so bright that they cast a faint, barely perceptible light on the playa surface. Not enough to read by, not enough to cast shadows, but enough to distinguish the pale ground from the darker mountains. In this stillness, the playa is perfect. The shallow water, if it is there, is perfectly flat. The ice, if it is formed, is perfectly still. The stones are resting in their places, waiting. Though of course they are not waiting. Stones don't wait. They simply exist in the gap between one movement and the next. Some of the most affecting photography of racetrack playa has been done on exactly these still nights, when photographers set up their cameras on long exposures and capture the star trails, the streaks of light that stars leave across a photograph when the camera shutter is open for minutes or hours at a time. The Earth rotates during those long exposures, and the stars appear to move in slow arcs across the sky, circling around the celestial pole where the North Star sits. In photographs like these, the stones of the playa sit in the foreground, dark and still and solid, while above them the stars are making their own trails, arcs of light, the record of the Earth's slow turning. Two kinds of trails in the same image. The stones trail in the mud, recording movement through space. The stars trail in the photograph, recording movement through time. Both are slow. Both are beautiful. Both are records of forces too gentle to feel directly, too patient to watch in real time. This parallel, stone trails and star trails, is one of the things that makes racetrack playa such a rich place for contemplation. It gathers together different scales of time and movement into one quiet image, everything moving, everything leaving a trace, everything patient. The North Star, which appears to stand still while the other stars circle around it, sits directly above the Earth's North Pole. It is a star called Polaris, and it has been used for navigation for thousands of years by sailors and travelers who needed to know which way was north. Polaris is actually a triple star system, 3 stars orbiting each other, located about 430 light-years from Earth. The light arriving at your eyes from Polaris right now left that star 430 years ago, in the early 17th century, when the scientists and scholars of Europe were just beginning to develop the tools of modern astronomy. The light is old, but it arrives fresh, clean, indistinguishable from light that left its source this morning. Light doesn't age in transit, it simply travels. Everything we see in the night sky is the past arriving in the present. The moon's light is about 1.3 seconds old when it reaches us. The sun's light is about 8 minutes old. The nearest star system beyond our sun is more than 4 years away at light speed. And the most distant objects visible to the naked eye on a clear night are millions of light years away. We see them as they were millions of years ago, when the first ancestors of our species were just beginning to find their way across the African savanna. Looking up at the stars from racetrack playa, from any dark desert place, is therefore a kind of time travel, not dramatic time travel, not science fiction time travel. Just the quiet, always available time travel of paying attention to the light that surrounds us, understanding that it carries its own history, that the night sky is an archive, and the playa below holds its own archive. Those trails in the clay recording winters and winds and ice and slow movement over years and decades. 2 archives in the same place, written in different media, on different scales, telling different chapters of the same enormous story. You are reading or hearing a much smaller and more recent archive tonight. This voice, this story, these words, an archive of gentle attention offered to you at whatever hour it is, wherever you are, to help you find your way toward rest. If there is someone in your life who would enjoy drifting off to gentle stories like this one, share this video with them. And remember, our playlist is full of other quiet nights in beautiful places. Water shapes the desert even in its absence. This might seem paradoxical, but it's one of the defining truths of desert landscapes. Most of the dramatic formations you associate with desert, the canyons, the flat-topped mesas, the sweeping alluvial fans spreading from mountain bases, the flat playas at the centers of basins, were created by water, ancient water, intermittent water, water that came in brief, intense events and then retreated and left the landscape changed. The basin that contains racetrack playa was carved by water. The mountains around it were shaped by water, their surfaces eroded into the ridges and gullies we see today by rains that fell over thousands of years. The playa floor itself was laid by water, those lake sediments settling flat and even at the bottom of the ancient lake. Water made this dry place, and water continues to visit it seasonally, and water sets the stones in motion. The Mojave Desert, which contains Death Valley and Racetrack Playa, was significantly wetter during the last ice age, which ended roughly 11,000 years ago. At that time, the Great Basin, the broad region of enclosed basins and mountain ranges that covers much of the American West, held hundreds of lakes. These were not small lakes, but large, deep bodies of water. Lake Bonneville, a predecessor of today's Great Salt Lake in Utah, was at its peak nearly 1,000 feet deep and covered an area roughly equivalent to the modern-day state of Lake Michigan. Lake Manly, which filled Death Valley during the Ice Age, was at times nearly 100 miles long and 600 feet deep. The ancient shorelines of this lake are still visible on the walls of the valley. Long horizontal lines scratched into the rock face at various heights, recording the different levels the lake reached over the millennia of its existence. These ancient lake levels are called strand lines, and they are among the most atmospheric features of Death Valley. Standing on the valley floor and looking up at the pale limestone walls, you can see these lines running along the cliff face, parallel and horizontal, the watermarks of a world that no longer exists. Each line is a memory. Each one says, the water was here once. The climate that ended these lakes, the warming and drying that followed the end of the last ice age, happened gradually over thousands of years. The lakes shrank slowly over generations. The animals and plants that lived in and around them adapted as they could, or retreated to higher elevations where conditions remained wetter, or went extinct. The human peoples who lived in this region adapted too, developing the specialized knowledge and skills needed to live in an increasingly arid landscape. And the stones, which had been submerged under hundreds of feet of lake water for thousands of years, found themselves gradually exposed as the lake level dropped. First, they sat on the shallow lake margin in the shallows, then on moist ground at the lake's edge, then on open ground as the lake retreated further, and eventually on the dry playa, where they began their quiet sliding. The connection between those Ice Age lakes and today's sliding stones is direct and unbroken. The same water that created the flat surface of the playa, that deposited the sediments that became the slippery clay, that filled this basin and then left. That same story of water is still unfolding every winter in the thin sheet of rain and the thin sheet of ice that carries the stones a few more feet in their patient crossing. The world is always telling the same story. It just changes the chapter it's in. In the mountains surrounding Death Valley, there are springs, permanent sources of water that emerge from cracks in the rock, fed by groundwater that percolates slowly through the porous limestone and emerges where the rock surface is exposed. These springs support small oases of life, stands of cottonwood trees, clumps of rushes and reeds, carpets of water-loving plants that seem impossibly green against the pale rock. Animals, birds, insects, small mammals gather at these springs because they are the only reliable water for miles in any direction. The pupfish of Death Valley are perhaps the most remarkable of the animals associated with these desert water sources. They are small fish, barely an inch or two long, that have evolved in isolation in the separate spring systems of Death Valley for thousands of years. Each spring has its own species or subspecies of pupfish, adapted to the specific conditions of that particular water, its temperature, its salinity, its chemistry. Some of these springs are only a few yards across and a foot or two deep. The fish that live in them have no awareness of any other body of water. Their whole world is that small spring, and they are perfectly adapted to it. The Devil's Hole pupfish lives in a single water-filled cave in the desert, a limestone cavern that extends deep into the rock. The fish live on a narrow shelf of rock near the water's surface, where enough light penetrates to support the algae they feed on. There are only a few hundred of them in existence. The rarest fish in the world, possibly the rarest vertebrate, surviving in a space the size of a large room, adapted to conditions so specific that they can survive nowhere else. These tiny fish and the enormous sliding stones and the ancient playa and the distant stars are all here together in the same desert night, all part of the same world, all doing what they do in their own time and their own way. This is the fact of the natural world that is both the most ordinary and the most astonishing. Everything coexists. Everything shares the same moment, the same planet, the same darkness and light. You share it too right now from your comfortable place. You are in the same world as the pupfish and the stones and the stars. That's a beautiful thing to carry into sleep. Perhaps the most wonderful thing about the sliding stones is how they change depending on who is looking at them. A geologist sees the mineral composition of the dolomite and the chemistry of the clay. A physicist sees friction coefficients and wind resistance and the dynamics of ice panels on shallow water. A meteorologist sees the specific winter conditions that allow ice to form at the right thickness, the right wind speeds needed to move it without breaking it. A photographer sees light and shadow and the visual poetry of dark shapes on pale ground. And someone lying awake at 2 a.m, tired and restless and needing something quiet to think about, sees something else entirely, sees the stones as a kind of comfort, as evidence that the world does extraordinary things slowly and without drama, as a reminder that patience and gentleness can accomplish things that force cannot. What do you see? You don't have to answer. It was a question for the quiet part of you that is already beginning to let go of the day, the part that is softening at the edges as sleep approaches. The trails left by the stones are, in a technical sense, called bilobate grooves, from a Latin root meaning two-lobed, because the passage of the stone pushes mud up on both sides of the groove, creating 2 low ridges running parallel to the trail. These ridges are very subtle. You might not notice them unless you knew to look, but they are there on every trail, the mud preserving the memory of the stone's passage with extraordinary fidelity. Fidelity is a word that usually refers to faithfulness, being faithful to a person or a commitment, but it also refers to the accuracy with which something is recorded or reproduced. High fidelity audio, for instance, reproduces sound with great accuracy. The playa has very high fidelity to the stones that pass across it. It records their paths accurately. It preserves the details. It is faithful to what happened. There is something touching about a landscape that records things so carefully, as though the earth itself is paying close attention, wants to remember what passed over it. Of course, it is not paying attention in any intentional sense. It is just physics, just the behavior of saturated clay under pressure. But the result is a kind of memory, and we can appreciate it as such. Human memory works differently, imperfectly, selectively, warmly, and sometimes wrongly. We remember things with emotion coloring the facts, with time softening the details, with the weight of meaning making some moments larger and others smaller than they actually were. The playa's memory is cold and precise and has no emotional content at all. And yet, both kinds of memory serve a similar function. They hold the evidence that something happened, that there was a before and an after, that something moved and left its trace. You leave traces too, in the people who know you, in the places you spend time, in the choices you make that affect the world around you. Even the most ordinary life is full of these quiet trails, marks you've left that you don't necessarily see from where you are. The world is better at recording them than we give it credit for. The valley of Death Valley is sinking, not quickly, at a rate of perhaps a few millimeters per year. but measurably, as the tectonic plates beneath it continue to pull apart. The region is part of the Basin and Range Province, an enormous area of the American West where the continental crust is being stretched, pulling apart like taffy, causing the surface to drop in some places, the basins, and remain elevated in others, the ranges. This process has been ongoing for tens of millions of years and is still active. The valley is getting lower. The mountains are rising slightly. The playa at the bottom of the basin continues to receive sediment from the mountains above year after year, maintaining its flatness. In 1,000,000 years, Death Valley will look different. In 10 million years, it will look very different. The stones that are sliding across Racetrack Playa today may be buried under many feet of additional sediment by then. Their trails long gone, their presence detectable only by cores drilled by some hypothetical future geologist. Or perhaps by then, after many more winters and many more ice events and many more gentle winds, some of the current stones will have reached the edge of the playa and begun their next journey down into the valley below, where they will rest among other ancient rocks and eventually be buried and compressed, and perhaps millions of years from now be uplifted once more into a new mountain range from which they will eventually fall again to some future playa and begin sliding again. This is the rock cycle, one of the great circular processes of Earth's geology. Rock forms from magma, or from sediments compressed into rock, or from existing rock transformed by heat and pressure. It is uplifted, eroded, transported, deposited, compressed, transformed, and eventually it cycles back through again. The stones of Racetrack Playa are somewhere in the middle of a journey that has no beginning and no end, just ongoing transformation. Tonight, they are stones on a playa, leaving trails in clay. Tomorrow, in geological tomorrow, they will be something else, and it will be fine. There is one more thing about the playa that deserves time and attention, and that is the sound of it, or rather, the sound around it. The playa itself is silent, as we've said, but the mountains that frame it are not entirely silent. In the right conditions, on evenings with a particular quality of temperature and air, the mountains make a sound, not a loud sound, not a frightening sound, just a low, intermittent tone, as though the rock itself is breathing. This sound is real, and it has been noticed and described by travelers in desert mountain country for a long time. The rocks expand during the day, heated by the sun, and contract at night as they cool. This expansion and contraction sometimes produces small sounds, low ticks and creaks, and occasionally deeper tones, as the rock adjusts to the changing temperature. Individual rocks making individual sounds, too quiet to hear up close, but in the stillness of the desert, sometimes audible as a very faint collective murmur. Additionally, wind moving through the narrow rocky canyons of the surrounding mountains can produce tonal sounds, the canyon acting like a pipe or a flute, shaping the wind into something with pitch and sustain. These sounds can travel across the flat playa and arrive at the listener's ear transformed and purified, a tone produced by geography rather than by anything with lungs or strings. If you were lying on the playa on a calm night, flat on your back, looking straight up at the stars, you might hear this distant canyon music, very faint, barely there, coming and going with the light desert wind. It would add the final element to an experience that already has everything: the stars, the cold, the flat pale ground beneath you, the dark mountains all around, the stones nearby in the moonlight, and now this quiet, sourceless tone from the rocks. You would feel in that moment very small and very held, small in the way that the universe is large and you are not, held in the way that the desert holds everything in it, not gently, exactly, but consistently. It is there. It continues. It will still be there in the morning. The experience of genuine wildness, of being in a place where human activity is minimal and geological time is palpable, is increasingly rare and increasingly valued. People travel long distances to reach places like Racetrack Playa, in part simply to feel what it feels like to be in a very old place with very little human imprint on it, to feel the ground beneath them that has been there for millions of years, to breathe air that has not passed through a city, to hear the silence that existed before we arrived and will exist after we are gone. This desire for wildness is not escapism. It is a recognition of something important, that we are part of the natural world, not separate from it, and that spending time in places that predate us and will outlast us helps us carry ourselves with a more appropriate sense of scale, not humiliation, not the crushing smallness of feeling insignificant, but a comfortable, restful smallness, the smallness of knowing you belong to something much larger than yourself. A stone on the playa is small in this same way. It is a piece of an ancient ocean floor now sitting in a desert basin at the bottom of a valley that is sinking in a mountain range that is rising on a continent that is moving slowly westward, on a planet circling a middle-aged star in the outer arm of one spiral galaxy among hundreds of billions. The stone does not know any of this. It simply is what it is, where it is, doing the only thing available to it, which is to rest and occasionally to slide. And you, with all your awareness, all your memory and planning and feeling and understanding, you can know all of these things and still, tonight, simply rest. You can hold the full complexity of what you are and what your life is, and still let your body grow heavy, still let your thoughts grow quiet, still let the story carry you the last small distance into sleep. We're almost there together. The last thing the desert offers you before sleep is this. A stone has stopped moving. It stopped weeks ago when the ice melted and the water evaporated and the wind stilled and the winter gave way to the first hesitant warmth of approaching spring. The stone has been sitting in the same place since then, on the pale clay floor of Racetrack Playa, perfectly still, surrounded by the slightly lighter patch of ground that was protected from the darkening of the sun while the stone rested there. Behind it, stretching back across the playa in a long, gentle arc that curves slightly to the left is the trail it left. A quiet groove in the clay, a few inches wide, flanked by two barely visible ridges of displaced mud. The trail runs back 40 feet, 60 feet, 100 feet, to where the stone began its recent journey. Though, of course, the stone began many other journeys before this one, in other winters, leaving other trails that are now older and softer and barely visible, slowly filling in with wind-blown dust and the gentle erasure of time. The stone doesn't know it has traveled. It doesn't know it has left a trail. It doesn't know it will move again next winter, or the winter after that, or perhaps not for 10 years. It simply sits, heavy and dark, on the pale ground, absorbing the warmth of the morning sun, cooling under the cold of the night, indifferent in the most restful possible way to everything around it. The playa receives the stone's weight without complaint. The clay below is firm now, dried and cracked into its familiar puzzle of polygons, and the stone presses down on it with the same pressure it is always pressed with, which is simply its own weight, distributed across its flat base, steady and consistent. Around the stone, the playa is exactly as it was before the stone arrived, or as it will be after the stone is gone. The vast flat space, the distant mountains, the clear air, the sky cycling through its colors from black to purple to pink to blue to the luminous white of midday and back again. The playa does not require the stone to be complete, but it receives the stone with the same equanimity it receives everything else: rain, ice, wind, the occasional boot print of a careful visitor, the brief shadow of a passing raven. The stone is complete, too, in itself, by itself, exactly as it is, dark and old and dense with ancient ocean sediments, varnished by centuries of desert exposure, chipped at one corner where it fell long ago from the mountain, resting now in this particular spot that is no more or less significant than any other spot on the playa, because the playa is entirely without hierarchy, entirely equal in its pale attention to everything that touches it. This is a good place to be in your imagination as you move toward sleep, not the cold desert night. We won't ask you to be cold, but the feeling of the playa, vast and even and quietly present, receiving everything, requiring nothing, going about its slow and patient life, regardless of what you do or don't do, giving you, in its indifference, a kind of permission. You don't have to do anything right now. You don't have to be anything other than what you are. You can simply rest in the space that has been here long before you and will remain long after, that holds everything lightly, that lets the stones slide and then rest and then slide again in their own time, in their own unhurried way. Somewhere on that playa right now, if it is winter, if it has rained, ice may be forming, paper thin, fragile and lacy at the edges, spreading slowly across the still black water in the cold, dark air. And somewhere in that ice, a stone is waiting, without knowing it's waiting, to be carried just a little further across the pale ground, to add a few more inches to its trail, to write one more sentence in the long, long story it is writing with its patient body on the patient earth. You have been a good listener tonight. You came here with your tiredness and your questions and your quiet need for something gentle. And you found these stones and these stars and this playa and the story of ice and wind and patience that no one fully understood for most of human history, and that now, understood, is no less wonderful than before. If this helped you rest, please leave a like on the video. It takes just a moment, and it helps this quiet channel reach more people who need a gentle place to land at the end of a long day. And our playlist is always here for you, full of other slow and careful stories from the natural world, waiting whenever you need them. Close your eyes now, if they aren't already closed. Let your breathing slow down just a little more. Let your hands be very still. The playa is still. The stones are still. The stars above are making their slow arcs across the dark sky, leaving their long trails in the light of cameras left open in the cold. Everything is moving so slowly that it feels like stillness. And stillness right now is exactly what you need. Good night. Sleep well. The stones will still be there in the morning, and so will the mountains, and so will the stars turn to their morning positions, but the same stars, faithful and brilliant in the same old sky. And so will we. A story for the Sleepy Nature Channel, where the natural world whispers you to sleep.